Okay, welcome back. So you guys, the students just did the presentation on their raise grant proposals. And I have some comments, some overall comments that I think all groups can benefit from as they wrap their proposal up. And your proposal is due 2 weeks from today. So that would be first week of November on Wednesday before the lab. Okay, so in the next week's lab, we are going to start a new lab, but you'll have time to wrap up your proposal and so forth. And if you still need more time, you'll have some time to do it over the course of the week. But in the following week's lab, we will start a complete a new assignment, and then your lab will be due before the lab in 2 weeks. Okay, so that's first thing. And here are some feedback that I want to give you. And that was the purpose of this assignment, really, to have you guys present your initial ideas about your corridor and how your project is going to function. And then for me, an opportunity to provide you with the feedback. First of all, when you write the proposal, your writing would be as if the city of San Luis Obispo is writing the grant proposal, right? Because that's one of the things about the RAISE grant. It's one of the few grant proposals where the local government writes the grants to the funding agency, which is the USDOT in this case, the federal funding agencies. Typically, local governments don't do that. All the money, the transportation money is funneled through Caltrans or the state agencies. So here are some other comments. So, and then your Caltrans, your San Luis Obispo Council of Government, they will be the partners. And some of those may provide, the city could provide it, or these agencies like SLOCOG or Caltrans could provide some matching funds. And especially if you're like two of the groups where the project involves improvements to a state route, you will have to have Caltrans on board. Otherwise, your proposal will not go anywhere. Okay. And again, it's not for the sake of this grant proposal that you're going to write. You're going to assume that I'm not asking you to get the letters of support or anything like that. You're just going to say in your proposal that Caltrans and SLOCOG are important stakeholders. You've discussed this proposal with them, and they are approving of this project and all that. You'll have it have to be said. In the real world, of course, you'll need real letters of support, signed and everything. But for now, for our project, just mentioning that you looked at these partners and you're aware, and then you've gotten, even though you haven't really gotten the permission, but mentioning that would be fine at this point. Okay. Second thing is that I would like you guys to find as recent data as possible. And that applies to crash data, that applies to traffic data. So try to look for as recent data as possible. I think 2019 would be a great example. So 2020 probably, typically I want you to find most recent data available. But if you don't use 2020, I understand that, because some of our traffic patterns were hit by pandemic. Some of our crash patterns were affected by the pandemic. So maybe using the 2019 data would be the best. So, okay, so don't try to rely on the data that goes too far back. So going up to, like, for example, for crash data, it would be great to rely on 2016 to 2019, for example, would be fine. Okay. Then so all of you guys need, all of the groups need more precise estimates of costs. So you're going to have to estimate the costs and benefits. The benefits would come from the crashes that would be avoided and so forth. So if the studies are reporting benefit cost ratios, you might have to go back and check if they actually reported the amount of benefits and amount of costs. Okay, because your cost estimate needs to be a little bit more precise than what I saw today. And that's completely understandable, right? Because you didn't obviously have that much time to look at it. So looking at some local projects, like one of the group one, I think, mentioned the local projects, where they looked at the Laurel Lane project, Laurel Lane Complete Street project. And I think looking at as much information as you can find from that project would be really good, because the cost estimate on that would be really close to the local cost. You can add some factor of inflation on some of the improvements that were made. And if you're making similar improvements, you can apply a factor of inflation, factor of additional cost, like maybe a 2, 3, 4% inflation, and then use those estimates would be wonderful. I think those would be really good if you're using similar types of improvement. If you're going on other data points, I think European Union might be a bridge too far. I think it's perfectly fine to find some interesting things that were done there. So ideas of improvement from European Unions, that'll be European Union would be perfect. That's really good, but I wouldn't rely on their cost benefit estimates. Okay, so what I will try to do is, even if I get an idea from Europe to develop the cost estimates, I'll look for something that was done locally, or at least in California, maybe. I think that would be a good approach to take. So we need to be more precise in terms of costs and benefits. Looking at local projects would be really good, even though look for ideas globally. But when you go back down to estimating the costs and stuff, try to find some more local examples, or at least more state examples. Okay, so anywhere in California coast, in Santa Barbara, even up in the Bay Area, LA area, Los Angeles area would be fine to use. Okay, but I'm sure you can find some of those projects. Okay, the other thing that I noticed in your proposals, I don't think you guys did a tremendous job, or a really as good of a job as you could have with the economic competitiveness and state of good repair criteria. And I'm not going to give you a whole lecture on those two criteria, but I would like you to go to USDOT portal, look carefully what they mean by economic competitiveness and state of good repair. Okay, and it's okay if your project does not score very highly on some of those criteria. I just need to be, so you just don't highlight it as much in your proposal. To the extent that you can, you just mention it and you move on from it. But I think reviewing what those two, especially, I think you guys did a good job with the safety criteria and quality of life stuff and some of the other criteria and partnership. I thought that those descriptions were right on. But I think I would still very much like all of the groups to look at what does USDOT mean when they talk about economic competitiveness and state of good repairs. You know, what might also be helpful is look at past proposals. And they won't be called raise grants, of course. They would be called build grants or tiger grants. Especially look at build grants. Look at past build grant proposals and see how they talked about economic competitiveness and state of good repair in particular, so that you guys have a good idea or a better understanding of what that means. Okay, because I thought that understanding did not come through in your presentations. Okay, and then the last thing, or one of the last things that is going to be very, very important for you guys to look at for your proposals is make sure that you have watched how to conduct the benefit cost analysis video. And I can provide the link here as well. On the chat again, but make sure that as a group, you have watched this video. From USDOT, so that you understand how to conduct the benefit cost ratio analysis. Now, at this point, it'll be also helpful for me to talk about how this lab relates to the last lab, right? In the last lab, I gave you the benefits and the cost for each of the alternatives. And you just had to come up with those B by C ratios and all that, more interesting measures of net present worth and, comparing different alternatives using incremental benefit cost ratio analysis and do IRR and all of that. This lab report kind of takes you one step back, where you're actually estimating the costs and benefits of each of the projects. And we're not doing it for multiple projects. We're not comparing projects here, but we are just doing it for one project, but we are actually going one step back. What I gave you in the last lab, I'm asking you to estimate this time around. Okay, for each of the alternatives, I gave you the benefits and costs. Now you're actually making an estimate of that for your project. You're only doing it for one project, but you're actually going one step back from what information I provided in the previous lab. So I hope you see that context of the big picture that I'm trying to get to here. Okay, so we are trying to make an estimate of the benefits and costs of individual project here. Okay. So these are all the things that I want to talk about in terms of what would be really important for you for the lab that proposal that you're going to work on. Are there any questions? So I'll give you a minute to maybe think through, maybe talk about what your questions might be. Are there any questions or clarification to what I talked about? I will provide this recording available for sure. So if you missed something, you can always go back and watch it again. However, I do need to know if there are any questions or anything that's still not clear, that maybe that you had a question in mind that I haven't yet discussed here about the lab. And this is not necessarily related to what I'm talking about last thing, that I'm talking about this lab, that's something that perked my interest here. In one of the groups, they talked about area-wide traffic safety improvements or traffic calming improvements, area-wide traffic calming improvements. And that had a benefit cost ratio of 0.1, which is pretty low. And it makes sense that area-wide traffic calming improvements would have low benefit cost ratio. And of course, in this lab, you're only doing improvements to one corridor, so that is not directly applicable to that lab. But I think there is an important issue to highlight there that I wanted to mention that might be useful for you as you get into the practice of transportation, but not necessarily for this lab. So what I wanted to talk about was that, yes, these area-wide traffic calming improvements, if you look at it from the lens of the benefit cost ratio, as we have learned it in this class, yes, those ratios are pretty low, because in that scenario, you're making improvements sometimes to places that haven't really had a lot of crashes. And because they haven't had a lot of crashes, even if you make the improvement, the crashes go down, it doesn't really matter. Like, because the crashes, if you already had zero crash, regardless of what the new crash number would be, those numbers of, if the crashes are very, very low to begin with, the crashes don't have a lot of rooms to go down after the improvements. However, that's why sometimes you have to look at the problem systematically, or systemic problem issue. You have to look at the system more in a systemic way rather than purely from a benefit cost analysis ratio. Okay, so that's why benefit cost ratio as a measure is not great for if you're trying to make systemic improvements. And there are ways to justify these systemic improvements that we talk about in the transportation safety class in CE 526 a little bit. So just want to kind of give a caution that, yeah, if you're doing one corridor improvement, the benefit cost ratio is an important measure, could give you the right information, and you can justify funding based on that. But if you're going for systemic improvements, relying on benefit cost ratio might not be such a stellar idea. I think you might have to augment your argument with other information that relates with systemic improvement. So you might have to look for, how do you justify systemic improvement when your benefit cost ratio doesn't really work as an argument? Okay, so kind of something to keep in mind on the side that I noticed in one of the presentation. I think it was group 2, which I noticed, and I thought it will be interesting to point out that systemic improvements typically have very low benefit cost ratio, but they still might be desirable. So you might have to, and this maybe applies to more for the funding agencies that might be looking to get systemic improvement, but they might not be seeing a lot of agencies propose that. A lot of cities propose that because the benefit cost ratio is really low. So how do we make sure that we are funding systemic improvements? Then we might have to broaden our grant funding criteria to not just include measures such as benefit cost ratio, but some other measures as well that play well with systemic safety improvements or systemic improvements in general. Okay, so that's something that I wanted to point out. With that, I will conclude my presentation unless there are any questions about this or anything about the lab. Please let me know.